When people hear Sega, they might think of the Genesis, the Dreamcast, or maybe even the Game Gear. But you don't hear about the Sega Saturn that much. This console went head-to-head against the PlayStation and Nintendo 64 and lost. So, what went wrong? Let's take a look. What's going on? It's Pojer, coming at you with another video. If you've seen a couple of my videos and you like what I do, hit that subscribe button right there. It only takes a second, but it helps our channel grow. My aim is to try to hit 20,000 subscribers by the end of the year. I don't know if that's realistic or not, but I just thought I'd put that out there. And if you haven't already, check out our store, shop.pojer.net. We have t-shirts, coffee mugs, and more. Anyway, let's talk about the Sega Saturn.
Never, not anywhere, but especially not on that other system. Simply because, with only one processor, it doesn't have the power to do it. Fly, plaything, fly. You're not ready.
Sega was starting to have some success with the Genesis after 1991 thanks to more aggressive advertising and the introduction of Sonic the Hedgehog, but the hardware was not cutting it compared to its competition. The Super Nintendo was capable of Mode 7, which was a background layer that was capable of 3D-like movement. This allowed for great racing games like F-Zero and Mario Kart. The Genesis didn't have this, so their racing games were no more advanced than Rad Racer on NES. If this wasn't enough, Nintendo came out with the Super FX chip, which boosted the Super Nintendo's capabilities a lot. From this, we would see some true 3D games like Star Fox. The Genesis was really looking obsolete at this point. In the arcade, however, Sega was making a big breakthrough with their Model 1 system board. They managed to produce some early 3D games like Star Wars, Virtua Fighter, and Virtual Racing. Virtua Fighter was the first 3D fighting game and had revolutionary graphics for its time. Virtual Racing, while not the first 3D racing game, it was one of the first to do it really well with very stunning visuals. The only problem was that the Model 1 system board was very expensive, and the Genesis was not powerful enough to handle games like these. As early as 1992, development for Project Saturn would begin. Unfortunately, the Saturn went through some developmental issues that delayed its release. They had to modify the hardware slightly after they found out what the technical capabilities of the upcoming PlayStation would be. Sega of America and Sega of Japan also had disagreements about the Saturn. Tom Kalinske, who was the CEO of Sega of America, didn't think the console would appeal to the US audience in its current form. But Sega of Japan would not give Sega of America a say on the development of the Saturn. Kalinske would try to hire the company Silicon Graphics to make an alternative graphics chip for the Saturn, but Sega of Japan shut it down. Silicon Graphics potentially getting involved would have been interesting, especially because they would instead work with Nintendo on the N64. Going back to the Genesis, Virtual Racing would end up being released on the console after all thanks to the Sega Virtual Processor, or SVP chip. This was an extremely powerful chip that allowed for many 3D polygons on screen at a time. As we can see, the game looks nothing like we've ever seen on the Genesis. However, this chip was very expensive and it was not profitable to keep using it, but it gave Sega an idea. Sega was afraid that the Saturn was not going to come out in time, and they wanted to give the US audience a taste of 32-bit gaming to hold them over. So they came out with the Sega 32X. This wasn't a separate console. Instead, it was an add-on for the Genesis that boosted the capabilities by a significant amount. Sega thought that the 32X could be a cheaper alternative to the Saturn when that does come out. Unfortunately, this add-on failed miserably. Only 40 games were released for it because companies knew better, and most of the games that were released didn't even utilize the 32X's capabilities. This caused consumers to lose trust with Sega. The Saturn would end up coming out about 6 months after the 32X in the US, so Sega should have just waited for the Saturn rather than rushing out the 32X to the market. The Sega Saturn would be released in Japan in November of 1994. The US launch was going to be September 1995, but Sega of Japan would demand an early release so that they could beat the PlayStation's launch, which was also planned for September. So instead, it was released in May of 1995, giving it a 4-month advantage over its competition. The The price was $399 and was bundled with the game Virtua Fighter. The hardware was definitely very unusual. It features 2 CPUs and 8 processors total, all of which had a different role. For example, the Video Display Processor 1 handled sprite and polygons, while the Video Display Processor 2 handled backgrounds. The Saturn was not capable of rendering 3D triangles, instead it used quadrilaterals. The games were disc only, but the console had a cartridge slot for memory expansion. The controllers were pretty lame. They're literally just a Genesis 6-button controller with a few extra buttons. So there's definitely some red flags here. It's not normal for any kind of console or computer to have 2 CPUs, and quadrilaterals are not normally used in 3D games. This weird hardware could be because of Sega's desperate attempts to one-up the PlayStation, but before we judge, let's take a look at some games. Here's Sega Rally Championship. This is usually one of the first Saturn games that people think of. It's a racing game where you have a limited amount of time and you must make it to the checkpoint to receive a time extension. It seems basic, but it's actually a revolutionary game for its time. It's one of the first games to introduce terrain where your car handles differently depending on the surface you're driving on. The graphics are also very realistic compared to virtual racing. In fact, no platform before this besides the arcade featured a 3D game that looked this good. This is a great game and an excellent start for the console. The Saturn would receive a few other arcade racing games like Daytona USA and Virtual Racing. The Saturn version of Virtual Racing is one of the best ports the game would ever receive. The game has 2 modes. There's Arcade, where you only have the 3 original stages and you have to beat the timer to the finish line. And then there's Grand Prix, where you have a few more stages. They definitely added more content to give you your money's worth. The Genesis version was good considering the limits, and the 32X version added some cool upgrades, but the Saturn version is the closest you're going to get to the arcade original and has way more features. Virtua Fighter was the pack-in game for the Saturn, and it's pretty close to the arcade version. Despite being a 3D game, you can only move in 2 directions. It's also a bit of a button masher. You can keep using the same attack and make it through a good portion of the game. It's a revolutionary game, but kind of a weak pack-in title when you consider that Nintendo would later bundle the N64 with Super Mario 64. I mean, which one would you rather play? Later on, Sega would release Virtua Fighter 2, which had more playable characters and better frame rate. This one is the superior version. Japan received quite a few shooters that are worth checking out. Layer Section is a 2D one with very nice visuals. What's nice about 2D games on the Saturn is that you usually don't have to worry about flickering. In this game, you have enemies both in the foreground as well as the background. Shooting the background is actually pretty easy. As long as your crosshair touches one time, you'll hit your target. This is a really nice idea. Overall, this is a fantastic game. Thunder Force 5 is mostly a 2D shooter with some 3D elements thrown in here and there. The visuals look great, and this feels like Thunder Force 3 on the Genesis, which is a big compliment. Konami would release a couple Parodius games on the Saturn. It's Gradius, but with some parodies of other Konami titles thrown in. I always admired the graphic style of this game. Since this is Saturn, we don't have to worry about flickering or slowdowns like there was on the NES version. It's unfortunate none of these games were released outside of Japan. The Saturn did receive some high-profile games from third-party companies. EA published some Madden games on here, so if you're into sports games, this will be up your alley. The console also received some 2D platformers like Gex and Mega Man 8. Even Tomb Raider got a Saturn release. So the console did receive some great games, but how did the Saturn do against its competition? Unfortunately, there were some things that didn't go Sega's way. The console had a terrible launch. The Saturn had a very sudden and surprise release that no one expected. Places like EB Games and Toys R Us received shipments of Saturns, but a few retailers were not informed about the release, including Walmart, Best Buy, and KB Toys. KB Toys specifically was not happy about this poor communication and refused to carry the Saturn after that. Speaking of launch, look at the launch titles. You notice anything weird about it? No Sonic game. In fact, the console would never receive a definitive Sonic game. There were some Sonic games, but that's not saying much. There's Sonic Jam, but that's just a compilation of the Genesis games, although there is a 3D overworld that gives us a taste of what a 3D Sonic game would have looked like. The closest thing we got was Sonic R. It's a racing game with some cool features. You can jump like in a normal Sonic game, and the characters have their normal abilities. There are several stages you can play on, and you can collect secret Chaos Emeralds that are hidden throughout them. Unfortunately, the stages are very small, and you're actually pretty slow in this game. You don't actually get as much content as the game leads you to believe. I do think this is an underrated game, but it does not count as a definitive Sonic game. Could you imagine buying a new console and the company's own mascot has almost no appearance on it? That would be like if the only Mario game on N64 was Mario Party. Sega was working on a legitimate first-party Sonic game called Sonic X-Treme, and looking at footage of it, the game definitely had some potential. Unfortunately, the game went through some serious development-related issues. The game was taking too long to make, and management was not happy with it. Sonic X-Treme would unfortunately be cancelled. To make up for it, Sega released the Saturn version of Sonic 3D Blast. It's an isometric 3D platformer where you must collect all the flickies and bring them to a specific location. The visuals are better than the Genesis version, and the special stages were actually 3D rendered. But it's a slap in the face that this is the Sonic game we've been all waiting for. Going back to the hardware, the Saturn was extremely difficult to develop games for. The console was extremely powerful, but developers had a hard time harnessing that power. It was also not very good at handling 3D graphics, but rather much better at handling 2D games. Sega also did not give third-party companies a lot of resources for developing Saturn games, so instead they had to use assembly, which is a very time-consuming and difficult-to-learn low-level language. Meanwhile, the PlayStation was much easier to program for. Game companies were more likely to program for the PlayStation rather than the Saturn for this reason. Sega would never be able to get the lead it wanted, especially after the N64's release in 1996. By August 1997, Sega only controlled 12% of the console market while Nintendo controlled 40% and Sony controlled 47%. The Saturn would be discontinued in 1998, less than 4 years after its release. The console did see longer support in Japan, and they would receive a bigger library of games. So anyway, there's definitely a lot of what-ifs here. What if Sega of Japan actually did give Sega of America more say on the Saturn? And what if Sega actually did hire Silicon Graphics to work on the console? We might be looking at a different situation. The Saturn had a lot of potential, but some massive issues held it back. The console had very unusual hardware that made it difficult to develop games for. There was also no real Sonic game besides a spin-off title, a compilation, and a reskin of a Genesis game. Unfortunately for Sega, this would be a commercial failure. Hey, I just wanted to thank you so much for watching this video. If you made it this far, hit that like button. If you enjoy this type of content, hit the subscribe button for more content. Both of these things really help the channel grow. If you have anything to share, feel free to leave a comment. I read every single comment on this channel, and I'm pretty good at replying back. Anyway, have a good one.